Alrighty, my friends, welcome back to our last installment for videos for this week. So we've touched on sustainable agriculture, what that means, organic v non-organic, and soils. And industrial farming, what does all that mean? So for our last video, I want to touch in on some farming practices that are a bit more sustainable, they're scalable potentially, and are ways that we can help better this industry to help not only like us for food, but also to help build communities, build structure and things of that nature. I do also want to mention that there are probably other different types of farming practices that are used and implemented perhaps around the world. Your book really touches in on a few, and I offer a couple of other ones that aren't in your book that I find to be rather interesting, and potentially some options just that we can have here in our urban or even in rural areas as well. So, touching first in on the main one that your book really goes into, and that's agroecology. Agroecology. So this is basically, it's a holistic approach where these farms have added in like multiple species basically to help come and help, in a sense, run their farm or do things for them that things like herbicides and pesticides would do and fertilizers would do, but they just all live beautifully together. So your book example is of rice paddies. There's one focus up in Vermont, and then that practice is actually modeled after one in from Japan, I believe. So basically what is happening here is you plant your rice seedlings. Excuse me. Excuse me again. And then ducklings are introduced here. And the ducklings, like little baby ducks, help eat the weeds, and they also provide fertilizer. And then fish are also introduced. Excuse me, gotta love spring, to eat these weeds and also provide fertilizer. And then azolla is then introduced to add nitrogen, and so then the ducklings and fish keep the azolla from growing up too much. So it's a really, really beautiful way. Oh my gosh, there it goes. Excuse me, to have multiple avenues and multiple ways of having a sort of industry, but keeping your rice in the mix as well. So what's really awesome with this is the farmer is able to not only harvest the rice, which is their main crop, right? That's the one that they were just trying to figure out how to grow anyway. But on top of that, they can also have ducks to harvest, duck eggs to harvest, and also fish to potentially harvest as well. So there's more opportunity for potential more profits to be made in this case. And it's just kind of a way that, and to make more money, to be more economically viable, but also be sustainable in that you're still providing the service of planting these crops. So this is a really nice way of polyculture or method of polyculture as opposed to monoculture, which we introduced when we talked about industrial sized farming and agriculture. So kind of a cool thing, I think. This sort of process is especially important for farmers in many developing countries who struggle to produce enough food for current populations, right? So developing nations generally don't have like the larger infrastructure to help aid in this process of farming and industry. So something like this is a really good way for folks to really capitalize on getting these multiple methods of harvest. Another, and also, it can also help them achieve food security as well, which is huge, right? You get, for something like this, you're getting multiple methods or multiple methods of protein or multiple avenues of protein from fish and duck eggs. And then you're also getting your good carbs from rice, and rice is a huge staple food for many, many, many cultures. So that could be a really good thing all around. Another type of of farming that is interesting is aquaponics. So your book just kind of touches on this idea, but when I was reading about it, I was like, oh my gosh, that is like so freaking cool. So aquaponics are where crops and fish are raised together in a system, as you can see in this picture here, which is from your book. So the plants are grown in hydroponic systems, which means that they're grown in water rather than soil. And then the fish waste or fish poo helps provide nutrients for the plants, and then the plants filter the water so that the water can be returned back into the fish tanks. So it's like this circular sort of system. The fish help the plants, and the plants help the fish, and the water is all there. So it's a really, really an interesting process that can be done. This can also be done in larger scales, like in warehouses or outdoor areas, or on smaller scales, such as like little bench hop hobbies or something that you can do just like within your home. But it's a really, really cool thing. And my partner's dad is actually a hydrologist, and one of his projects that he's been working on is to implement aquaponics in various regions, especially in like desert regions where it's really hard to grow plants. So you can, again, have this like really beautiful combination of crops and fish and protein, which is kind of cool. Then some other traditional farming methods can vary from location to location, farmer to farmer. This is an image from your book, kind of outlining some of the 6 different traditional farming methods: contour farming, reduced tillage, terrace farming, crop rotation, strip farming, and covered crops. Folks and farmers can use a combination of methods, perhaps, which can be utilized to help increase crop yields in the short term and in the long term. So when I was talking to my dad to kind of, figure out what his farm does, one thing that I heavily remembered when I was a kid is the crop rotation. So when I would go down to my grandparents' farm, like to have grandma babysit me while my dad and my grandpa were out in the farms, I had always heard them talk about crop rotation. So in one year they'll plant corn, and the next year in that same space they'll plant soybeans. And so that's an example of crop rotation. So you're not completely depleting the soils of nutrients by having a monoculture, right? Remember that term from the first video. So crop rotation allows for that differential in nutrients. My dad also uses cover crops on his soy, which is down here, on his soy. So at harvest, he will plant cereal rye, which is a type of grass. Which has better roots, and it grows pretty quickly and also helps prevent erosion. So I thought that was really cool and helps keep the soil healthy. And then what my dad also does is he does a no-till. He does not till the soils. He literally calls it no-till, which I'm assuming is a reduced tillage here. Which also, of course, helps with soil erosion. So they basically don't go in with any plows, but he does use herbicide in the springtime as well. So right before he's going to plant his corn, he'll put down the herbicide, he'll plant the corn, but he won't till it. So that's one of the reasons, a synthetic herbicide, which is one of the reasons why he's not technically considered an organic farm, even though his crops are for animal consumption, not human consumption. So I thought that was really neat. So this is done again in the state of Iowa, where I was born and raised. And he's actually, so where I grew up, the town I grew up in is called Earlham, and that's in the Corn Belt. So there's like less work that they would have to do if he had farms up there. But because his farms are down in southern Iowa, like right at the border of Iowa and Missouri, he has to do a bit more legwork to make the soil nice and good and yummy for his corn and his soybeans. So there's more on that. If you have any questions on that, let me know. I'm happy to ask him any more questions if you have any. I also have a few more things that I don't have time to mention in these videos, but some really, really interesting stuff if you are ever if you ever want to start farming or growing your own foods. So I encourage you to kind of look further into these other ideas of traditional farming methods Really neat concept, I think. But what I wanted to touch on a bit, besides traditional farming methods, are some of like these newer farming methods. And I say newer, but they're not like brand new. When I was looking a bit further into them to get details to put into lecture, I learned that like these are actually not new at all. Some even some indigenous peoples had been doing things, especially regenerative farming. Like that's an age old farming method, but it's one that's coming back, I think, and we're giving it this term, regenerative farming. And this method, the definition actually seems really, really close to sustainable farming. The difference is that it's an application and management of methods, and it's also trying to restore the land from the nutrient depletion from industrial methods. So it's basically like a farmland or ag space was almost completely devoid of nutrients, just over farmed, what have you. And so maybe a farmer is trying to remake the farm to be regenerative. So this uses ecological practices that rejuvenate the soil, grasslands, and forests, which also help replenish water, promote food sovereignty, and promote public health. So again, very similar to sustainable farming, but just a few minor key differences within that. So I encourage you to look into regenerative farming a bit further. It's a really, really fascinating topic, I think, and one that's kind of gotten a bit more attention as of recently, especially because a lot of farms are not doing so well right now because of bad farming practices. So I encourage you to look further into that. Another farming method, which is, I think, really, really good for urban areas in particular, but it's also one of my suggestions for all of these office buildings that no longer are being used by folks who are working from home. Turn these buildings into vertical farming areas. I know it's not the most feasible thing and it would be expensive and whatnot, but it's a thought. It's a thought. So vertical farming, much like it sounds, are crops that are grown vertically in hydroponic systems, much like the aquaponics that I talked about earlier. But instead of being on the horizontal and taking up a lot of space this way, they just take up space this way, right? And it's in a controlled environment. So I think that there's a lot of really good, important points here. Takes up less space, year-round production. You don't have to necessarily worry about spring and fall or spring and winter, like the variation in seasons. Elimination of environmental impacts, which I think is going to be huge when it comes to climate change impacts around the country, around the world. It can also be a solution to food deserts. So places that cannot grow crops very well. Arizona, the state of Arizona, or really any desert region are a really beautiful example of that. Really hard for them to grow good quality crops. So if, could be a helpful solution for that, and also reduced emissions. If you have these vertical farming areas in urban regions and you're able to grow these beautiful leafy greens, then you're not having to transport them from Central California into San Francisco. They're already here, right? Or from, wherever you're at. So it could be reduced emissions. It's not perfect. Of course, it's not. There have been companies and startups that have been trying to build this idea. Some have been more successful than others for whatever reason. I encourage you to look further into this idea as well. And just kind of open your mind a little bit, right? Be open to ideas that maybe aren't conventional. And it's not to push out our amazing farmers that are doing work in the fields. I love that for them, absolutely. But we need to start thinking of ways that aren't in that horizontal space. And again, there's probably other methods that are out there that I just haven't been able to look into, but these two are ones that I think are very fascinating. Last thing, of course, we have to touch on, we can talk about all these good things, but we do have to talk about the trade-offs of sustainable agriculture. Obviously, it's more expensive for the consumer. I shouldn't say obviously, but it can be much more expensive for the consumer. It's one of the things you're going to be looking into for one of your assignments this week. There's also this thing called greenwashing, and this is something that I have certainly fallen victim to, and maybe you have as well, and no shame there. But greenwashing is a huge misleading to customers. So basically where it makes claims about environmental benefits of sustainably raised organic foods that are misleading. Not great. So for example, something like organic cookies are probably not healthier than those made with conventional ingredients, and cage-free eggs may still come from chickens living in overcrowded conditions. So especially with eggs, there's so many of those things that are put on egg cartons, like cage-free, no antibiotics, free range, pasture raised, like all of these terms that make us as consumers think that we're consuming better when in fact it's generally not the case. So it's a thing, and it sucks. It shouldn't be on the consumer. It should be on the companies that are doing this, but hey, listen, I guess it's on us too, unfortunately. So be cautious of that, be wary of that. And I'm saying that for myself as well. There can be a shorter shelf life of produce. It can be labor intensive, fewer government subsidies, so not as much government money going towards organic farming or sustainable farming. And then farmers would then need to go to training to implement these sustainable practices. Like the method that they've been practicing farming their whole life is different from the sustainable practice. So like, what are they going to do to alter that? And sometimes it's really hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Can confirm by talking to my father. Not to say that he wouldn't be open to doing any of these things, but the man's 78 years old at this point, so it's kind of like, sheesh, what can he do to make things better or different? Now it's on my brother to see what happens with that. So lots of really interesting information here. Of course, I didn't cover everything that your book covers, which is why it's a multitude of reading and content from the videos. I encourage you for the millionth time to look further into these ideas if you have any interest. Look further into not just crop growing, but also how we raise animals and the ethical values of that or unethicalness of that. Really, really fascinating. We are a farm country. And that's how we feed the country and the world. So it's just really interesting stuff. So with all of that, thank you so much for your time and attention. And I appreciate you. And I hope that you enjoyed. Cheers.